Ya se lo pasé a su correo. Te copié, Lorena.
Estamos aquí esperando. Vamos a ver. Después hablamos. Fausto ya está conectado también.
Sí, Lorena, ¿cómo estás? Está aquí presente.
¿Qué dice Fausto? Desde y media acá.
Hola, Lorena, estoy conectado. ¿Me escuchas?
Sí, Fausto.
Ah, perfecto.
Qué dicha, gracias. Muy bien. Sí, yo creo que solo estamos esperando a Cris, ¿verdad?
Sí, sería solo Cris, le faltaría.
Sí, te enviaron un correo, pero no. Allá. Ahí está. Ya entró.
Ahora me tiene que mandar el enlace para internet.
Sí. Luego le mandan el enlace a ustedes. ¿Ok? Cris ya está adentro.
Sí, ya la vi. La voy a renombrar ahorita.
Catherine, tenemos los micrófonos prendidos. El público está escuchando.
Señor Rubén, por favor, empecemos.
Tengan muy buenos días. Le damos una cordial bienvenida. Informarles que en esta oportunidad contamos con el servicio de interpretación traducción. Pueden acceder a esta función haciendo clic en el icono que aparece en la parte inferior y seleccionar la opción de español para poder escuchar la traducción. Vamos a dar inicio al presente seminario web sobre los videojuegos como industria creativa estratégica a desarrollarse hoy lunes 5 y mañana martes 6 de octubre, no sin antes agradecerles por su gentil participación, así como a la Organización Mundial de la Propiedad Intelectual como coorganizador y a los expositores invitados. Es objetivo del evento destacar la importancia de la protección de la propiedad intelectual en las creaciones intelectuales, como son los videojuegos, el cual reviste de hoy en día una gran importancia económica. Invitamos a continuación al doctor Fausto Bienrich Enríquez, director de Derechos de Autor del Indecopi, para que nos dirija las palabras de bienvenida. Adelante, doctor.
Muy buenos días con todos. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Mis primeras palabras sean para citar al filósofo alemán Hans-Georg Gadamer, quien sostuvo que el juego es una función elemental de la vida humana, hasta el punto de que no se puede pensar en absoluto la cultura humana sin un componente lúdico. El webinar que nos convoca, titulado Los videojuegos como industria creativa estratégica, es una iniciativa del Indecopi, a través de la Dirección de Derecho de Autor, que cuenta con el importante apoyo de la Organización Mundial de la Propiedad Intelectual, OMPI, apoyo que agradecemos profundamente. En los próximos 2 días recibirán información especializada y de interés acerca del panorama actual del sector de los videojuegos, reseña del marco jurídico relativo a los videojuegos que comprende el marco legal e internacional. Asimismo, el marco legal en el Perú e importancia de la propiedad intelectual. Acceso al mercado de los videojuegos e implicancias legales, desarrollo y distribución de videojuegos, marketing y protección de datos personales, los deportes electrónicos, esports y aspectos normativos, los videojuegos e inteligencia artificial. Impacto económico y coronavirus. Según cifras obtenidas de Newzoo, una de las agencias de estadísticas más importantes del sector del entretenimiento digital, La industria de los videojuegos alcanzará unos ingresos de 159.000 millones de dólares en este año 2020, un 9% más con respecto al año anterior. Dentro del sector, son los videojuegos móviles los que más crecerán este año. Sus ingresos alcanzarán los 77.200 millones de dólares. Esto es un 13% más que en el 2019. El número de jugadores móviles llegará hasta los 2.600 millones, aunque el 38% de ellos gasta dinero para jugar en sus dispositivos. También se espera que los juegos para consolas experimenten un incremento del 7% y alcancen más de 45.000 millones de dólares en ingresos, contando con 729 millones de jugadores en todo el mundo. En cuanto a las computadoras personales, los ingresos serán casi de un 5% más que en el 2019, sumando unos 37.000 millones de dólares aproximadamente, con 1.300 millones de jugadores en todo el mundo. En lo que respecta a los deportes electrónicos, en el año 2019 se generaron más de 1.000 millones de dólares. Las predicciones de Newzoo para el 2023 son auspiciosas, pues se espera que el mercado global de los videojuegos superará los 200.000 millones de dólares. En España, por ejemplo, esta industria supera ampliamente la facturación del sector audiovisual y musical conjuntamente, consolidándose así como el principal sector del ocio y el entretenimiento, según la Asociación Española de Videojuegos AEVI. La realización de este evento es significativa y por el impacto innegable de la industria de los videojuegos en la economía mundial y porque está relacionada con modelos innovadores de negocio digital, como los deportes electrónicos, y las nuevas herramientas como la realidad aumentada y la realidad mixta. Se trata entonces de un sector protagonista en el cambio de modelo de consumo, que brinda interesantes oportunidades laborales, así como también promueve, destaca y tiene en cuenta el rol, opinión y aporte de todo aquel que participa del juego activamente y como espectador o aficionado. Sus voces son permanentemente escuchadas por las empresas desarrolladoras. En el escenario de la denominada nueva normalidad, el confinamiento ha generado que aumenten las horas dedicadas a los videojuegos. El informe publicado por la empresa sueca Reddeye, los inversores que apuestan a la industria del gaming pueden sentirse a salvo de la problemática que trajo al mundo la propagación del COVID-19. Esto también se debe a que durante esta época de aislamiento ha surgido un nuevo público de consumo constante, al que se le ha brindado la posibilidad de disfrutar y probar títulos gratuitos de gran calidad. El auge de la industria de los videojuegos y los deportes electrónicos está unido a la imperiosa necesidad de utilizar las herramientas del sistema de propiedad intelectual. Los principios del derecho de autor, la protección jurídica del software y base de datos, el contenido de los portales y páginas web de la industria de los videojuegos, el reconocimiento de los derechos sobre personajes y música, así como la literatura que se deriva de estas creaciones, son fundamentales para promover el desarrollo de este sector. Asimismo, el impacto de los deportes electrónicos se refleja en lo individual y en lo social, pues millones de personas son espectadores de transmisiones a través de Internet o acuden a torneos presenciales. Consecuentemente, este modelo comercial comprende derechos de transmisión vía streaming, patrocinadores e incluso derechos de imagen. En este contexto, la industria de los videojuegos y los deportes electrónicos ha sufrido grandes cambios con la introducción de los smartphones, las tablets y los juegos desarrollados, a veces exclusivamente para estos, lo cual la transforma en una economía de multitudes. Además, es un hecho comprobado que está invadiendo otras áreas ajenas al puro entretenimiento, tales como la educación, a través de juegos con una gran proyección y beneficio para la población. Todo ello nos conduce a un mundo virtual en donde se pueden realizar operaciones de mercado y actividades económicas. Por consiguiente, las iniciativas en el ámbito jurídico y los marcos normativos no deben ser ajenos a lo que ocurre en el mercado y estar atentos a las tendencias en el campo de la tecnología. Agenda pendiente, Perú. La industria peruana de los videojuegos continúa creciendo y desde el 2005 aproximadamente se han desarrollado cerca de 600 títulos, en su mayoría para dispositivos móviles, según un estudio del Ministerio de Cultura financiado por el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. La investigación titulada Mapeo del ecosistema del sector videojuegos en el Perú, desarrollada desde finales del año 2018, revela que la producción de videojuegos en nuestro país continúa creciendo. Hasta el año 2019, las compañías encuestadas registraron 118 juegos propios y cerca de 500 juegos para terceros. En el último año, 36 fueron videojuegos autofinanciados. Estas empresas emplean profesionales entre desarrolladores, productos, músicos, programadores, artistas y otros. Además, en el 2017 el sector facturó cerca de 7.150.900 soles. Finalmente, mencionar que iniciativas como este webinar buscan no solamente dar a conocer y profundizar sobre la situación y diagnóstico del sector de los videojuegos y los deportes electrónicos, sino también poner en contacto a los actores propios de esta industria, desarrolladores, instituciones y aficionados que tienen un rol importante que cumplir en cada etapa del crecimiento de la industria. Reiteramos nuestro agradecimiento a la OMPI por su valioso apoyo de siempre, así como a los expositores por el tiempo dedicado para compartir sus importantes aportes. Desde el Indecopi ponemos a disposición las herramientas de la propiedad intelectual a través de la Dirección de Derecho de Autor, que estamos seguros coadyuvarán al desarrollo y crecimiento de la industria de los videojuegos. Los invitamos a que aprovechen y compartan los conocimientos, las valiosas experiencias que nos traen los expositores, así como también amplíen su red de contactos con representantes e instituciones que tienen un rol importante que cumplir en este proceso de desarrollo del sector de los videojuegos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Bienrich. A continuación, damos pase a las palabras del señor Dimitar Ganchev. Dimitar es representante de la División para la Gestión de Derechos de Autor de la OMPI. Adelante, Dimitar.
Thank you very much, Ruben. It's a great pleasure to see you on the screen. Fausto as well as Carla, as well as David, as well as all of the speakers, the excellent lineup which has been put together for this seminar. We all wished to be in Peru today, but unfortunately that wasn't possible at the moment. I'm sure one day it will happen. It is really a great pleasure to organize the first webinar on intellectual property and video games. So far, we've always done physical events. This is the first time we are doing it online because of the circumstances, but that doesn't make it less important. Peru is one of our most active members from Latin America, a country where the creative industries have flourished, and a country which has shown a great taste for creativity and for creative industries. Creative industries are on the WIPO agenda for the last 15 years, and I think that they're here to stay. Our new Director General has indicated last week that we will continue to supply services to the business and to the creative sector, and most certainly the video game sector is going to be among our priorities for the future as well. Indeed, my colleague Fausto made a brief overview of the importance of games today. Incredibly fast developing sector, the fastest developing of all the creative sector, where the growth is phenomenal, about 50% higher than the average growth rate of the global economy. Probably this year it will be even more. It is a sector which is extremely well interconnected with the rest of the creative economy and with the rest of the economy as well, and a sector which has major spillover effects both in demand and supply of other industries. Fausto spoke about the incredible economic potential and impact of the video games industry, but let's not forget that it also performs very important social and cultural functions, and it is becoming part of our reality because video games are always half real, as you know. The region of Latin America has always been very active in games, and this is one of the regions where we record the highest market growth in recent years. So most certainly the future of video games is very bright for Peru and for Latin America in general. What we hope to do with this webinar is to talk to you about some of the issues in the industry. With this reduced program, in light of the circumstances, we cannot cover even half of what we want to discuss with you. But we hope that we will provoke some questions and some thinking, because the best lecturer is the one who disseminates doubts, who raises doubts in your minds, and then you start finding the truth. I think that it is a memorable day today. On this day in 2011, the world lost Steve Jobs on the 5th of October 2011. And you will remember that everybody lit a candle on their iPhones. And I think that this light is still shining. And I hope that this light will guide all the video game developers who participate in today's webinar. I wish you a very interesting debate. I hope that you will have more questions at the end than in the beginning of this webinar. And WIPO is always by your side, ready to help and ready to assist you in disseminating the tools and the power of intellectual property in this creative sector. Muchas gracias. No translation.
Yeah, I apologize, but I can't hear Ruben.
Rubén, estás en mute tu micrófono.
Ni tampoco.
No se te escuchó nada.
Discúlpeme. Muchas gracias. Tenemos a continuación las palabras de David Greenspan para el análisis de la situación actual del sector de los videojuegos. David es profesor adjunto de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Santa Clara, autor principal de la publicación de la Organización Mundial de la Propiedad Intelectual, Dominando el Juego, aspectos comerciales y legales para desarrolladores de videojuegos de California. Adelante, David.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hola, greetings from San Jose, California. And I am also disappointed I am not in Lima. And hopefully we'll be able to go there one day. Instead, I am doing my first webinar in shorts and at 7:30 in the morning. And I'm going to expand on what Demeter and Fausto talked about, the video game industry, the tremendous economic growth over the years. And the goal for the next 25 minutes or so will be to throw out a bunch of numbers to you to understand the extent of how big this industry is. I'm going to compare it to other industries. And I'll also talk about some of the major players in the industry and then conclude with what some of the issues are, ranging from business, marketing, and legal later on. And I have a PowerPoint presentation. It is in English. The PowerPoint presentation that I will provide to participants in this discussion is a lot longer than what I am actually going to talk about because the video game industry is so vast. It's impossible to talk about everything, so I'm going to try to focus on the main points, but the PowerPoint will go into a little more detail, so you have that as a resource. So I'm going to share my screen now. And great. Okie dokie. So let's talk about some numbers with the video game industry. And Fausto had mentioned that it was reported that the video game industry in 2019 was about $148 billion. By 2022, it's projected to top 200 billion, which is just an extraordinary number in a relatively short period of time that has exceeded all other forms of entertainment, including film, book publishing, music, theater, and television. And just to give you an example of how much it has grown, in 2017, the revenue was about $108 billion. In 1995, when PlayStation was first launched, the industry was $4.3 billion. It was dominated by Nintendo and Sega at the time. And if I did my math correctly, which is probably wishing a lot, is that since 1995, it's shown an increase of roughly 3,300% in 25 years. Comparing it to other industries, the film industry in 2019 generated revenue at $101 billion, which at the time was a record. Unfortunately, 2020, you are going to see numbers drop dramatically, obviously, because no films are being shown in theaters. How difficult it will be for them to rebound is unknown at this time. But while the film industry and other industries in the entertainment sector are going south in revenue because of the virus, unfortunately, the video game industry, in contrast, has actually set record-breaking numbers as reported in the last quarter by the major publishers. Book publishing generated about $119 billion in 2019, although other reports have it at $143 billion, and the music industry is at $21.5 billion in 2019. Ironically, the music industry right now needs video games in order to promote artists, and we're going to see that later on during the discussion. I also like to compare it to professional sports leagues. And here are some of the numbers, and you can see the video game industry dwarfs the numbers that are generated by the professional sports leagues in the United States, as well as in England, the English Premier League. And interesting enough, a lot of the revenue outside of television has been primarily generated by video games. And Take-Two, which is a major publisher, entered into an exclusive deal with the NBA just in 2019 for $1 billion. That's a far cry of 25 years ago when I was doing deals and I was doing licenses where I only wish that we could give that type of money. And then there's FIFA, which is the organization that oversees football throughout the world. And you can see that the revenues also are relatively small compared to video games. And I also like to point out two games. These two games have been revolutionary in the video game industry. You probably know them. Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of them. The other game is Fortnite. And Grand Theft Auto, which was released in 2013, at the time earned $800 million within 24 hours, which was a record. And it was somewhat unheard of that a game could achieve those type of numbers. It sold more than 11 million copies in 3 days. Fast forward In 2019, it earned $595 million. So this is the same game that was released in 2013 is still making incredible amount of money. And how do they make that type of money? Well, they've updated the game through various forms of distribution where a consumer can now buy items, speed up their gameplay perhaps, play different new levels, all through digitally downloaded content. And as a result, the publisher doesn't necessarily have to make a new sequel for the game, but instead just provides additional content. And the very successful games are able to do this. It's a very cheaper way for a publisher to exploit properties. Instead of having to start from scratch and create a new game, they can just continue to give updates and new content. And obviously this has been incredibly successful. It has made over $1 billion in the last 4 years. Again, incredible numbers. It's the most successful entertainment property that has ever been released. And then pretty much everyone has heard about Fortnite. It's made billions of dollars. And what's incredible about this particular game is that it is free to play. And similar to Grand Theft Auto, it makes its money through primarily microtransactions where people buy content to be able to play the game with different avatars, different features, perhaps. It also may give them the opportunity to speed up their play. Again, incredible numbers. And it earned a reported $3 billion to date. It made $2.4 billion in 2018. It made $1.8 billion in 2019. There was more competition, so that's one of the reasons why people felt it didn't make as much. However, it's most likely that in 2020, it will probably exceed the amounts that it made in 2018. Some interesting facts about Fortnite. It has been reported that over 350 million people have played the game, which is an incredible number. $1.2 billion was earned on Apple's iOS. Apple made $360 million from licensing fees. And that is going to be very important because we're later going to discuss a recent lawsuit where Epic has sued Apple and Google, claiming that the fees that they charge the developers is anti-competitive and involved in antitrust action. So we'll see what happens. And for Apple to all of a sudden pull Epic off their site is substantial because Apple was making so much money as well as the creators of the game. In addition, you have also seen something that's somewhat relatively caught on big time, and that's people just watching other people play games. This has been something that's been growing over the years, but now has reached incredible numbers. And just in the second quarter of 2020, 175 million hours on live streaming platforms, specifically Twitch is the leader in that. And then the other interesting thing about Fortnite is that the amount of people who never played video games before all of a sudden decided that they wanted to play Fortnite. And that number was 21% in 2018. And that's a very positive sign for developers and publishers because people that have never experienced video games are all of a sudden participating in them. And then other ways in which the publisher Epic Games has made money, which I found pretty interesting. It's been accomplished just in the last few months, and that's when live events actually occur inside the video game. And music has been one way in which Epic has exploited additional ways of entertainment. The DJ performer Marshmello, his performance was watched by 10 million people who logged into the game. And what's great for the musicians is that they have this audience already built in. Unfortunately, musicians are unable to perform because of the virus, so they have looked to video games as a possible alternative. And subsequent to Marshmello's performance, Travis Scott did a 10-minute concert and had 27.7 unique viewers, 45.8 million total viewers watched 5 shows over a period of time. And clearly that would be the biggest audience in the history of music with those types of numbers. And then last week, Epic actually announced that they were going to start a new concert series that will appear in Fortnite. In addition to concerts, there are weddings, there are meetings, there are other social activities all within the game. And why have we seen this incredible increase in revenue over the last 4 years? And there are a number of reasons. More accessibility to games because people have smartphones. They have access to them 24 hours, and that's throughout the world. Games are digitally downloaded now, which provides easy access to gamers. In addition, you have various business models. Some of those models involve spending $60 for a premium game at a retail store, which, by the way, the price has not increased in many, many years. Or they can just play a free game on a mobile device, and many people do that, in fact, and that's why the numbers are so huge. Mobile devices have become more powerful, allowing more people to play games at a higher level. You have the growth of esports, which has also attracted a lot of people and viewership. You eventually have cross-platform play, which is beginning, where someone could be playing a game on a PlayStation console and that same game can be played on another platform. And innovative gameplay. You know, all these things wouldn't matter if games were boring. And in fact, they're not. Some of the developers have created amazing content. And what's great about the industry is that it continues to expand with very creative, independent developers who 20 years ago were unable to enter into the industry because it was somewhat a closed environment. And as mentioned before, the coronavirus has increased numbers across the board. Whether those numbers will be maintained after the virus is unknown. I personally don't think the numbers will be as high. However, the numbers will still be strong. And as previously mentioned, video games are
Los videojuegos son
growth and innovation. Innovation that has been used in science, business, the military. It's created tens of thousands of jobs, not just game developers, but expanded marketing, licensing, legal, and is now a major program in many universities across the world, including the United States, where over 400 universities have programs on game development. They vary quite a bit, but they definitely have courses on basic software development. And as also mentioned, games have become a leading form of social interaction, online play, building of gaming communities. The fact that you can play a game or watch a game and provide comments has been a very successful way to communicate, something that cannot be copied by other industries in the entertainment spectrum. Also, the World Health Organization recognized the value of playing games to keep people occupied and maintain social distancing. I think this is rather significant because previously, the World Health Organization classified video games as addicted and a mental health disorder. So they also recognize the benefits as well with video games. So the next thing we'll talk about relatively quickly is the territories. This has been a game changer. It had been previously dominated by the United States, Japan, and third was Europe. But China now has all of a sudden become the #1 territory, not only in revenue, but also consumer participation. That has been primarily driven by mobile devices. And China and the United States typically trade off on who's the #1 country in revenue. The United States was the #1 country last year, but prior to that, China had been the major revenue country in the last 4 or so years. China market is projected to hit 36.5 billion. It's part of the #1 region in the world, which is the Asian Pacific market, and that is led by China. Japan is the #2 market in the world at 19 billion. It's also home to PlayStation and Nintendo. And surprisingly, for many people, South Korea is also one of the top 5 major players, and that is driven by a very tech-savvy society, very big onto online gaming, esports, and mobile devices. And what's interesting about Asia Pacific, it probably will grow because India doesn't actually have a lot of revenue being generated from that country, yet it has 1 billion people, and it also has probably 1 or 2 of the most people that actually have access to mobile phones. So potentially India is going to grow substantially. North America is the second biggest market. It represents 25% of the overall market. Canada, kind of throw it in, it's close to about $2.5 billion, but the United States mostly makes up for the revenue. Europe generated about $30 billion. It is considered the slowest growing market, but it has a massive development community, not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. Latin America is next, and you can see the numbers drop substantially. They dropped from 30 billion in Europe to 6 billion in Latin America. But the good thing, as Dimitri mentioned, it is a growing market. Greater access to the internet has helped access to more mobile devices. So it will continue to grow. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia are the leaders in revenue. Mexico and Brazil are in the billion-dollar category, whereas Argentina and Colombia are in the hundreds of millions. And then finally, the Middle East and Africa will generate about 5.4 billion and will grow the fastest at 14.5. Here's a chart. And one thing to understand is that numbers can vary quite a bit from different data reporters. Newzoo is probably the most well-known and most reliable, but a lot of times when they talk about numbers, they're projections. And this is an example of what they were projecting for 2020. The question is, how much did they factor in the virus? Because the number could grow quite a bit. So I'm very curious to see what those numbers will look like. And then here's a chart for Latin America on the top 5 revenue generated companies. And if you have good eyesight, you can actually read what it says. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about very quickly is who is playing video games. And previously, it was the teenage kid probably sitting in his basement by himself playing a game. And in 1995, 30 million gamers, about 50% of them were 18 or younger. And today the demographics are completely different, where the average age is about 30 to 35. That is helped by the fact that many of these people grew up probably playing PlayStation 1 or one of the Nintendo consoles and have maintained their love for the games. Also, you're seeing a huge jump in the amount of female players. It's not quite 50-50, and depending on what report you see, some numbers may vary, but supposedly 54% of people are male, 46% are female. And in some countries, depending on the type of game and the platform, there are more females playing than males. There are more than 2.7 billion active gamers. That doesn't mean they all pay, but they're active gamers. And China and the United States represent the most in spending and the amount of players. 46% or 1.1 billion spend money on games. So that's a pretty good number to play with. And again, the reason why you've seen this incredible growth, easy access to games on a number of different devices, various types of genres of games, from the very complicated games such as Call of Duty to sophisticated sports games to the very simple puzzle games. Various price points, and obviously free games attract a lot of people, can be played anytime, anywhere in the world. So who are the main players in this industry? And we will discuss later today and tomorrow more detail about some of these players, but the primary player is a developer. They're the ones responsible for creating the content, the software to create the game. So what you see on your screen The developer could create original IP content, or they may license that content. So for example, they want to have a game based on Spider-Man. So they license the rights for Spider-Man, but they create the original IP to run the software. The publisher is perhaps one of the biggest players. Think of them as a Hollywood studio in many ways. They are involved not only in developing their own games and hiring companies to develop games for them, they create their own IP, they license IP, but they also finance a lot of games as well. They're involved in the manufacturing, the distribution, basically the publishing of a video game. So getting the game made to actually getting it to the consumer. And they are the biggest player. The console manufacturers, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, they are the gatekeepers of their platforms. We're also seeing a little retro action with Intellivision, Atari 2600, and Sega Genesis. Probably a very small market, but maybe a fun market as well. The other platforms, PC, which has come back to life in the last few years, driven by digital distribution, mobile, and then there's tablet. Digital distribution, the big player is Steam. Epic Store entered the picture in 2019, and we'll talk a little more about that later this morning. Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo Switch are also involved in digital distribution, and that has resulted in a good share of revenue for the console manufacturers. There's also something called cloud computing, where the games rest on basically servers, and as a result, that allows for someone to play across platforms. They also can play very sophisticated games on any type of device. So buying a console no longer serves as a barrier for many people to play games. This is very new. You have big players, however, behind it that believe that it is going to be the future of gaming. There's also the retailers who still sell video games at their stores as well as consoles. The market has dropped substantially, but still an important player. And then there's the ancillary players such as the esports leagues and teams, licensing of video games. You have augmented reality, virtual reality, and then Twitch, which we'll talk about quite a bit during the next few days. So the one question I have is, I'm not sure when I have to finish because I may want to actually jump ahead. Can someone tell me when I'm supposed to? I'm supposed to originally be at 7:50, but I know we started late. So I'm going to assume that I can maybe go to 8 o'clock, and hopefully that's a good assumption. I'll wait for anyone to tell me otherwise. So this is what I quickly mentioned about the roles that some of these.
Yeah, adelante, David.
Yeah, what's that? Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So I mentioned what the publisher's role is. I also talked about the developer's role. And an interesting thing about how this industry has changed is to look at who the major companies are. This is a list of the companies that are the biggest publishers. So they're involved in console distribution, mobile distribution, digital distribution, licensing. They may do some things better than others, but these are the dominant players. And typically, those players were from the United States. You had a handful maybe from Europe and Japan. But now you're seeing companies coming from China. And Tencent is the biggest company in the world when it comes to video games. They have their hands in everything, it seems like. And then NetEase is also on that list, another major company in this space. And that's in contrast to when we look at mobile, which you'll see more of an international spread with mobile companies. So here's that list, in fact. And you can see Tencent is the biggest. It's followed by Supercell, which is based out of Finland. There are many American companies, Activision, Electronic Arts, but you also have companies from Japan. So Bandai Namco Entertainment is the #1 mobile company in Japan. Wargaming from Belarus, and that basically put Belarus on the map. Very successful. Another company, Rovio from Finland, you may know them because of Angry Birds, and then Netmarble from South Korea. So you're seeing a really nice mix of companies from all over the world, and you're also seeing different companies instead of the major publishers. So there are publishers that just focus on the mobile space. That's what they do the best, and they've been very successful at it. Roblox at the bottom is one of those companies, a very innovative company when it comes to creating content. So one of the biggest changes that we've seen, and I assume that many people in the audience are probably independent developers, where they have no connection to any publisher and they are creating a game either on their own or they're getting finance from a publisher. They typically will own the intellectual property, and they have become a major player in this industry. And again, for a number of reasons, primarily due to the fact that easy access to devices, in many ways, just a click of a button to get onto these platforms to be able to distribute their game, and they can do it worldwide. But we'll discuss later today and tomorrow the precautions that they need to take. So the entries to the video game industry has changed dramatically. At one time when the PlayStation came about, as well as Microsoft's Xbox, Nintendo, Sega, they were the gatekeepers, and you had to get your game approved. And you had to spend X amount of dollars in order to manufacture a product, to get your product into stores. It was a very complicated process, and it could be a very expensive process. And therefore, you really didn't have independent developers who could do that on their own, and instead would form a relationship with a publisher who had money and access to these markets. And you no longer necessarily need those things. So therefore, the independent developer has evolved. However, it still can be very challenging for an independent developer when going into the market. So these are some of the things that I've already discussed: lower barriers of entry, the introduction of mobile devices, digital distribution, also lower cost to develop for certain platforms, especially mobile, and the availability of software that allows developers to quickly do certain things in game development, because at one time developers would have to learn how to create software. It would be very expensive for them. It would be very time consuming. So a lot of that has been taken off the table, and instead they just have to pay a license for the rights to use this software. Here's another graph, and we'll talk about this in more detail. It's already been mentioned what the revenue stream looks like. In many situations, smartphones and tablet games are put together into one class. That's why it represents about $77 billion in revenue. PC digital distribution is 33.9, and that's usually combined with the browser. Browser PC games is probably the only part of the video game industry that is decreasing rapidly in revenue because of the alternative forms of distribution, such as mobile devices. And then console games make up 45.2 billion, and that's a combination of retail sales as well as digitally downloaded sales. And let's jump to some of the major trends that we're going to probably see in the near future. There's a few pages. So greater access to games via various forms of distribution. So the growth of mobile, the growth of digital, the birth of the free-to-play model has all resulted in more games being consumed by the public. One of the changes regarding exploitation of games is we're seeing something called or described as games as a service. So the game is part of an ongoing service whereby the developer or the publisher continues to update the games. There could be a season pass. So they're trying to generate revenue by continuing the distribution of the game. And EA, for example, has really put a lot of their money behind that to expand on that, because at the end of the day, successful properties can be exploited in other ways. And again, because some games are given away for free, and because the price of games hasn't changed much from $60 at retail, when games have increased substantially in development, video game companies are trying to figure out a way in which to raise revenue other than perhaps raising the price of a retail game. So in addition, you've seen the growth of digital. And again, one of the key things is that it's prolonging the life of games. If the games do well, the developers will create new content. And as a result, the game can continue to make money. Cloud gaming is going to possibly be a new form of distribution, and then cross-platform compatibility. You're seeing increase in the number of independent developers. More people are watching games on television. One report had it that they thought all the major networks would in fact televise the broadcasting of video games because it would be too important not to do such a thing. And then here are some other areas that we've already talked about that you'll also see continuing growth in the video game industry. Andy is going to talk about esports, and it's already been slightly mentioned. Even it generates about $1 billion today. Now, that's a small number in comparison to the $150 billion industry. However, esports attracts a tremendous amount of attention. There are a lot of people interested, so it's expanding the video game space, and I think it's going to be around for a long time. There are new forms of ways in which companies are going to be able to make money. It gets complicated with teams and leagues, but it is definitely going to be something that will be here for a while. In fact, the Olympics was even considering having it as a sport. Asia, North America, and Europe are the three dominant markets when it comes to esports. And Andy will probably talk about some of these other issues. VR technology and augmented reality, that's something that Dimitri may talk, or Gaetano will talk about later. And then some numbers. And then I'll just quickly, well, I say quickly, but I don't know. So just 2 more minutes on what are some of the legal and regulatory issues that developers will have to face. And some of those include the right to privacy. And why is that all of a sudden a big issue? Because a lot of games are given away for free, and developers, in order to try to target their audience, need to get a wealth of information. And sometimes that information may involve what the player likes, where they're located, so forth and so on. And that kind of worried regulators that companies were getting too much information. So as a result, there have been a number of regulations passed throughout Europe. There's something recently here in the state of California called the California's 2020 Consumer Privacy Act. So there's been a greater concern about regulatory issues and privacy issues in the video game space that developers absolutely need to be aware of. And not only that, if they decide to license software to use in their game, they have to be very careful that that software that they're using doesn't obtain personal information that they're not aware of. So the GDPR is probably the most important regulatory issue dealing with privacy, but in the United States, you also have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Big concern about targeting games towards children, especially if they involve things that you may have to spend money. China also has their own issues dealing with regulatory matters. They are concerned that children are playing too much, so they're going to potentially regulate that. You have gambling issues that have also drawn a lot of attention throughout the world, something called loot boxes, where a consumer doesn't necessarily know what they're getting, but they're giving some form of consideration. Many countries consider this a form of gambling. So Netherlands and Belgium have banned it. There's legislation in Europe and in other parts of the United States considering whether in fact loot boxes are a form of gambling. And this came about because video game companies were trying to find another way in which to raise revenue. And this was one of those ways, especially in games that are free. And it generates an incredible amount of money, but the video game industry, at least the big players, have become more conservative when dealing with loot boxes because they are concerned about regulation by various governments. In addition, you're going to see new issues involving intellectual property that will probably result in litigation on ownership issues from trademarks, copyrights, patents, rights of publicity, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Employment issues will also become a big issue. There's been a lot of talk about the formation of unions in the industry. There are issues with long hours, sexism, and growing awareness of more diversity. And then finally, in the United States, there's an issue regarding whether someone is hired as an independent contractor or an employee, and the ramifications of that are substantial, because if they are deemed an employee, then there are greater obligations on the developer to pay that employee and to follow up with taxes and so forth and so on. So that's a fight that has been brought about from the e-commerce society with Uber and Lyft, and whether the drivers are in fact independent contractors, but that will have an effect on the video game industry. And finally, I'll end it on this. And this is probably going to draw a lot of attention across the world. It's antitrust and anti-competitive issues. And this ties all the way back to digital distribution. And in this particular situation, Fortnite, or the game involving Fortnite, which is developed by Epic, has sued Google and Apple, claiming that the fee that they get violates anti-competitive laws, and that the only way that people can play the game is that they have to pay for it through an app that is part of Apple, and that they can't perhaps pay another way, which Epic tried to create. As a result of Epic's decision to try to create their own pay system, Apple basically pulled them from the App Store. And as we mentioned before, millions and millions of dollars are earned by both parties. So this is a substantial move, and we'll wait to see what happens. And traditionally in the video game industry, console manufacturers, digital distributors, mobile device companies all take a 30% fee. And now Epic is going to challenge Apple on how they get paid, and also whether that 30% fee is anti-competitive. So those are probably there. So I'm also advertising and marketing influencers, which you can read about later. So those are definitely the biggest issues from a legal standpoint. And in the next 2 days, we'll talk about some of the challenges that are facing the industry. Many other forms of entertainment exist. Are there too many products for particular platforms because they're easy to access? It's an industry driven by dominant titles. They represent a significant amount of the revenue that's earned by this industry. You have rapid technology changes regarding devices and the use of software. Developers have to keep up with that. That can be challenging. You also don't know whether those rapid changes are going to be successful or not. And you have to invest in a game perhaps many years ahead before it actually comes out. So that's a big risk that you take. Development costs are going up, marketing costs are going up. So that makes life a little more challenging. The legal landscape is changing. It varies from country to country. So that is significant. So what may be accepted in one territory may not be accepted in another territory. And you're also seeing a lot more regulatory action. So that's a very quick summary of the video game industry.
Muchas gracias, David. En realidad muy interesante, muy amplia la información que nos brinda sobre el comportamiento de los mercados del videojuego, así como las tendencias a futuro. En realidad, toda tu presentación muy enriquecedora en realidad. Te agradecemos muchísimo. Estoy observando que en el programa tienes también tu participación acerca de la reseña del marco jurídico relativo a los videojuegos. No sé si me has podido escuchar todo el tiempo, ¿sí? Entonces, porque si es así, tendrías hasta las 10:20 para poder participar. No sé si... Fernanda, me estás...
Oh, no, so I didn't hear that. So I first want to apologize to the translator because she had to probably speak very quickly, and I was worried about the time. I have a history of going over. So, so I have another 15 more minutes to perhaps speak? Or should we leave that for the next speaker? Oh, well, I can leave it for the next speaker, which coincidentally happens to be me.
Puedes continuar hasta las 10:20 porque tenías la primera sesión y la segunda sesión ¿no?
Yeah.
Prácticamente hasta las 10:20 de la
Oh,
mañana.
okay.
O sea, tú puedes continuar tranquilo y después que termines
Oh,
la
so what
segunda
so what I
sesión,
would,
vienen las preguntas y yo te las voy a formular.
oh, okay. So do you want me to go right into the intellectual property discussion right now?
A la segunda sesión, porque entiendo que tienes esta presentación que acabas de ofrecernos, ¿no? Y en la segunda sesión, que es hasta las 10:20 de la mañana, todavía tienes espacio para seguir desarrollando, sin ningún problema.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm unsure. So I'm going to jump into the second discussion, which is going to be about intellectual property, which is obviously significant. So let me see if I can find it.
Ahora, si tú prefieres, porque hay preguntas que nuestros participantes nos están haciendo llegar, si tú prefieres, te formulo las preguntas.
Okay, but again, I'm not sure. So after this session ends, will I still be presenting on the intellectual property afterwards, after 10:20, or am I?
Exactamente.
Oh, okay. So we have an extra. Okay, fantastic. So we do have
Correcto.
10 minutes left for this particular session. It would have been 15 minutes if I didn't ask so many stupid questions.
Correcto.
So,
Correcto.
so I am definitely open for anyone to ask me some questions. I'd be happy to field them.
Están llegando, ok, están llegando varias preguntas por si acaso.
I hope I can give many answers.